Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session on stopping the extinction of reality in an artificial world. We're here to talk about synthetic data, both about how it's being used in a commercial sense, but also about how it's being leveraged within the AI industry itself. And just to introduce myself, I'm Beatrice Nolan. I'm an AI reporter at Fortune magazine based in London. I'm thrilled to be joined by Cristina, who is the Chief Social and Innovation Officer at Razorfish, Jason Mander, who is the Chief Insight Officer at GWI, and Gannon, who is the Director of Engineering for Applied AI at Google. So we're going to spend the next 40 to 45 minutes just talking about some of the possibilities and limitations around synthetic data, and then we're going to save some time for 10, 15 minutes at the end to ask some questions. So please think of some while we speak at you. But first, Jason has kindly prepared some slides to kick us off with. So, hand to you.
Amazing, and the clicker worked. Morning, everyone. So, yeah, I think it's always helpful to set the scene with some context. So this is some results from new original research we've just had back from the States. We asked 550 advertising and marketing professionals for how, when, where, and why they're using AI across business at the moment. Which use cases, what sorts of results they're seeing, how optimistic they're feeling about it, what barriers and challenges they're seeing. Now, anecdotally and through reports, we've all heard that AI usage is already widespread in business, but it's great to actually have some numbers to back that up. So the first point that came out of this, and I should say it's advertising and marketing professionals across all industries, mix of company sizes, mix of seniority, absolutely everyone took part in this research. And it's nearly 85% who are already using AI in their business, 50% regularly. So 1 in every 2 advertising and marketing professionals in the US already regularly deploying AI. Now, the US is not necessarily reflective of every other country, I'll grant you that. Quite representative, yeah. But it is where the largest share of advertising money is still spent, and it's a good proxy for markets like the UK. So I think what you're seeing up here is also going to be taking place in the other mature markets. So we know that AI is being used widely. Unsurprisingly, at the moment, it's more likely to be deployed in simpler use cases. So people told us they're most likely to be using it to find and summarize data, to write copy, summarize copy. They're less likely to be using it for creative tasks or to produce final deliverables. But the numbers there are still pretty impressive, and the enthusiasm to use AI tools throughout the entire workflow is certainly there. So that number, I think, is going to tick up even higher really quite quickly. We also asked which tools are being used, and perhaps unsurprisingly, ChatGPT tops the table at the moment. Almost 8 in 10 are using it. It also has the highest share of regular users. But the chasing pack is close behind. Gemini, Copilot doing very well as well, and in some of the industries, one of those 2 names moved to the front. What I think was particularly interesting is that 30% of the companies we spoke to already have their own internal tools, and many that didn't expressed the fact that they were coming quite quickly. What also stood out, and I should say there were 16 tools that we surveyed about, I'm just showing a selection of them on the slide today. What also stood out is that the average professional was using 4 of the 16 tools that we asked about. Now, if you think about search behaviors that we've all been accustomed to for years, I know it feels a bit old school to talk about search right now, but probably not many of us had 4 different tools that we went to. We had discovered our favorite one, and that became established. So you have to imagine after this early sort of experimentation and adoption phase, we may find the numbers for some of these tools dropping as people consolidate around a preferred platform or platforms. It's also quite possible to think that the capabilities of the tools will become more and more commoditized. You will broadly be able to do the same thing on many of them. What that suggests is that the data that's supplying them and powering the outputs will become more and more of a differentiator. And that is a segue to the second of the slides. Now, we asked our advertising and marketing professionals about 15 very typical use cases and workflows that they might be doing in their business. Everything from audience targeting and understanding, to media and campaign planning, to creative development, to budget planning, to vendor selection. And we asked them which inputs they're using across those use cases. And these are the aggregated results. So across all of those 16 different workflows, we said, what are you using? And a couple of things jump out. One is that intuition and personal experience is still top of the list for now. But interestingly, if you compare AI users to non-AI users, personal experience and intuition doesn't change. What does change is that the range of other inputs increase massively. So people in business are able to make their decisions in a much more data-enriched, informed way. The second thing that stood out is that across the various inputs you see on screen, people were using an average of 5 of them. That's quite a lot of context switching, platform switching, having to move between different inputs. And given that insights from AI tools are already in third place, you have to imagine that a lot of the bars further down this chart, which represent what you might call more traditional or classic research approaches, will increasingly be incorporated into those AI tools to become used there rather than separately. The other thing that I think is worth noting is the fact that AI insights are already the third most used input is quite remarkable. Many of those others have been around for 10, 20, 30 years, and in the relatively short space of time that AI tools have been present, they've already managed to come third, and pretty soon will be even higher. Now, you saw on the first slide that 85%-ish of people are already using. What's holding back the 15% who are not currently adopting? Well, these are the stated reasons on screen. And actually, I don't think a lot of them are true. What is very, very telling here is that none of these was the very most popular answer. And interestingly, the younger the respondent, the more likely they were to say none of these. The older the respondent, the more likely they were to say lack of expertise or security and privacy concerns. So what we're probably seeing there is a generational divide, and younger employees whose companies have not yet adopted AI tools simply can't understand why. They don't believe the barriers that are being cited, and this is very likely encouraging shadow usage on personal accounts, which is exactly the thing that decision makers were worried about in the first place. One of the reasons I think there's some sort of false signs in here is if you ask businesses about their adoption of tools normally, something like vendor selection would be, if not top of the list, very prominent. Here it came bottom, just 6% citing that. And a lot of the other concerns are also very easy to overcome. So this is cultural and to some extent generational resistance, which I think is going to evaporate quite soon. So the 85% you saw on slide 1 is very likely to creep up to 100% of businesses in the industry using AI tools before very long. So I said earlier that the data, arguably in my view, is going to become more and more important, and that's going to be the focus of what we're talking about for the rest of the session. But I wanted to give a couple of images to illustrate why I think it's so important. So let's start with the one on the right. Earlier this week, I asked one of the leading tools to generate me an image using the information it had available to it on the open web of a typical electric vehicle driver. And this is what came back. Now, the first thing you may or may not be able to see is that the charging cable is plugged into quite a strange place. Spoiler, I don't think that vehicle is going to charge very effectively, given where this gentleman has plugged it into. That's one of the quirks of AI that will continue to get better and better. This is just one of those strange mishaps you still have to look out for. What I actually want you to focus on is when I asked it to generate an image of a typical EV driver, it went straight for a middle-aged white businessman. I wouldn't mind betting it's also a heterosexual middle-aged white businessman who's been styled to have the classic signs of success, very prominently showing the watch, suited, looking very proud of his EV. If you then ask it to use consumer insight data to style the same image, you get a very different result that's far more nuanced and balanced and reflects the reality of EV drivers across the UK. And a less extreme example is on the left. There I asked it to generate an advertising image that it thinks would appeal to typical EV drivers. Using the data available on the open web that it could scrape, it comes up with a very classic urban environment. Feed in data that tells you what EV drivers actually care about and where they really enjoy driving their vehicles, and you get a very different result. The vast majority state preferences towards rugged rural environments. So a simple example, but hopefully one that illustrates the very different outputs you get when you're using what I might call robust data versus what it can find on the internet. And that image of the driver, when I looked at all of the sources, it was scraping from government reports, from free statistics that it had found, from some quite outdated research papers that research companies had put out 2-3 years ago. And that, I think, is the problem that exists at the moment. The capabilities are getting better and better, but the data that it has available to it are in some way holding it back. One of the things we're going to be talking about is whether synthetic data can plug that gap. We've all heard the story that at some point, quite soon, models are going to run out of data to train on. And there is a school of thought that has been saying that synthetic data should help plug that gap. And as Cristina will well know, within our industry, we're seeing more and more uses of synthetic data to give input into workflows. So the questions we're going to answer really are, is that a good thing? Is it a sensible thing?
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you so much for that. It was an amazing place to start, and also great to have some visual examples of what we're about to talk about. Maybe a good place to start is with, some of the commercial opportunities of this. I mean, there's a lot of excitement around synthetic panels and synthetic personas, especially in the market research and insight industry at the moment. And, helping brands test ideas earlier, move a bit faster, and also fill some of those gaps where the data is incomplete. So maybe, Cristina, if we could start with you. And then the marketing industry has been experimenting with synthetic data a little bit. So where do you see the most promising approaches on that?
Oh, I can tell you that our clients, and quite a few, they see this as a way to get to more powerful strategies and approaches. It's all about the quest for efficiency, right? And so, and with generative AI and the advent of these chat experiences now, they see that this is now something that can bypass perhaps all the focus groups, the first-party research. We now can test creative concepts. We can come up with the brief just from the models or the chat experiences themselves. And what we're finding is that, hold on, first of all, these tools aren't there yet, okay? They're amazing tools to do a lot of amazing things, but to your point, we have to start with that human data. It's about the actual human data that you are basing those responses off in the model. Mm-hmm. And for example, at Razorfish, we have a tool called Seed. It's our virtual focus groups. And what we're doing right now is we're pulling in GWI. I mean, not a plug for GWI, but we are pulling in GWI because we needed a validation point. Mm. We needed something to tell us that what this persona, this machine is telling us is actually rooted in a true human insight. Because it does, it looks for averages. It's a probability machine. It's not actually telling you, it's not thinking and giving you the types of human responses that, an actual, there's no way it can get to the complicated nuance of an actual real person. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that. And so I think that these are amazing machines to give us anecdotal insight, right? Directional insight, but that you actually need real first-party data to give you any sort of credibility, mm-hmm. or to make you feel, or to actually give you the truth that you need in order to make a real recommendation. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've definitely heard it's not more about not replacing real human insight, but more about deciding what to take to yes. real humans afterwards. I don't know if you can expand a little bit about that as well.
And so it's a great starting place. Mm-hmm. So we think about, and I know, we often talk about underrepresented groups and how is the model actually getting into the truth of those, let's say, an underrepresented cohort. I don't think you would ever use a model to rely on a model to give you those insights. I think you use a model to give you the questions perhaps, and to help you start to fine tune what are the questions you would maybe want to ask to a cohort through real first-party research that you would commission. That's one way to think about it. And it's a great starting point for these things. You know, I think we've talked about it before, that it's about getting you into a better, smarter, faster place to begin those conversations, rather than supplement or actually give you the answers, right? Because it's not going to do that, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then Jason, I know that you work so much with data and audience insight, so you probably know better than anyone that data is like never complete and it's always evolving. So in terms of synthetic data, we've been cautioned against a lot of things. I mean, this idea of garbage in, garbage out. What's the main risk when we're relying too heavily on synthetic data?
Yeah, I mean, look, to be clear, I think synthetic data is wonderful and amazing and has huge promise and will become more and more used within our industry, and rightly so. But understanding what you're using it for and where the source data has come from is absolutely crucial. At the moment, we're seeing results from synthetic are very strong when it's a simple sort of binary yes-no decision and it's a mainstream audience. As soon as you introduce any complexity, the results start to deteriorate quite quickly. And when I say complexity, I don't really even mean that complex. If you want to have multiple choice answers rather than a binary yes-no, it struggles. If you move to anything that's not a mainstream audience, it struggles. So as Cristina said, it's great for directional input, especially I think early in processes if you're looking to validate a hypothesis or get a quick turnaround. But there's a profound difference to, is my target audience likely to resonate with this image versus where do I spend millions of dollars of ad budget across different media channels? So understand how you're deploying it and the quality of the data that's going into it. But things will continue to get better and probably at a speed that is scary.
Yeah, I think this idea of data, the quality of it is really interesting. And then perhaps to apply that to the models themselves as well. You know, we've all had this idea that eventually we're going to run out of data to train models on. And, you know, we've been seeing synthetic data work in certain contexts for model training and optimizing. Yeah, but I'm wondering, like, under what conditions synthetic data does actually improve model performance and where is it helpful?
At the risk of saying it depends. I mean, look, we've talked about one of them so far with underrepresented groups within the data. It's an important one. One that we've dealt with a lot at Google has been, we don't have the data. We have the N count is too small, so we need to fill in the data. And another one I'm not as familiar with is privacy. If you don't have access to the data or it's sensitive, you can use synthetic data to kind of fill in those gaps. And those are like several areas where I think with limited use, it can be very helpful.
And then I know that you've used synthetic data to create some revenue models for ad tech, and it's slightly different, but I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about that. No.
Synthetic data is not new. What's changed, I guess, is the LLMs are changing the way it can be created. So in this particular case, we were trying to, we have small amounts of data within the long tail, especially in different smaller markets where we don't have the same financial information as we do, say, in America or in the UK. What we did was we used a very rules-based approach, kind of traditional heuristics, to fill in what we thought the spend patterns would look like and usage patterns would be. And in those scenarios, it was great. We were less worried about individual humans. We weren't getting the kind of biases creeping in, but well, not about individuals, but we certainly were about how those markets might spend because, and again, I don't remember the specifics, but take, for example, Vietnam, we might not have loads of data there, but we might look to nearby countries to say, well, the spend patterns might be similar. That obviously introduces biases that ignore that local market. And over time, while it did help us improve the accuracy, it was nowhere near as good as getting out there and getting the real data.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you've all mentioned in your answers is this idea of it not being fantastic about underrepresented groups. So maybe we should turn to some of the ethics around synthetic data as well. You know, there's issues of bias and then also issues of flattening diversity and the privacy issues we've touched on a bit, but perhaps to all of you or whoever wants to take it. If we're relying on synthetic data from a marketing and an insight perspective, are we at risk of sort of smoothing out this data towards a medium, if that makes sense, and, you know, flattening out that outliers? And then from a commercial standpoint, does that risk sort of making our insights less accurate over time as well?
Yeah, I've got a very strong point of view on this. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the models are trained to give the most obvious, logical, expected answer, which makes a ton of sense, but humans are contradictory, complex, messy. We think one thing and do another. We say we care about the environment, but buy cheap, non-eco-friendly products. We are easy to learn from, but we're very difficult to predict. And I've seen sort of examples in our industry where the outputs have been so all-encompassing or bland and generic as to be useless. So a media plan that recommends investing in every single possible channel and touch point, which is just so far from the reality of what you would actually want to do. And just to pick up on that point about underrepresentation, when we say underrepresentation, we're probably all thinking really sort of niche groups, but they're not, you know. So yes, we see LGBTQIA+ results that are far worse than for heterosexual groups. We see non-white ethnicities that are worse than for Caucasians, but we even see worse results for women versus men. So,
especially in healthcare.
Yeah, so this idea that it's underrepresented, you know, pretty dominant parts of the population, the results are still not there, let alone when you then want to think about what healthcare professionals or policy decision makers might say. And there's almost a vicious circle, because an obvious use case for synthetic data is to fill the gaps where you haven't got enough data on that group. But so the very groups that you most want to use it for, there'll be least information to train on and learn from. And so something doesn't quite work there.
What's interesting too, though, as you were talking about this, is that it also speaks to the skill level of the individual then that is using the model as a tool. And if you have the experience and the know-how, you will introduce in those edge cases and kind of those guardrails, right? So you can tell the model that you need to think of this nuance, or to ensure to watch out that we are thinking about this women in this particular healthcare topic. The thing that worries me, and again, now I'm gonna segue, is that in this race to, oh, these tools are going to be transformational, they're going to change the way that every organization works and the structure of teams themselves, right? In some cases, organizations, you've seen it in the news, we can now have very junior folks using these tools, which will be a great cost savings, let's say. The issue is that these tools reflect back the skill level of the person actually using them. And so I don't know what that means for, and I'm not here to make a statement about what that means, but we should be thinking about that, because a person with less experience in a certain field using this tool may come back with a media plan that says everywhere, all channels, omni-channel campaign, whereas I
they
think
don't have the experience and they think it's a good output.
that is exactly right. I feel like they're a mirror. And so it's something to just take into account as we move on. I don't know how that's going to shape the structure of organizations, but it's something to think about. Yeah.
I think, well, if I can jump in quickly.
Of course.
Just in terms of like thinking about the impact on the models, like something that I've observed is that, you know, this synthetic data, it actually does flatten the model because it exacerbates and trends toward the mean. So anything that's got a lot of representation within the data is going to get pushed up, while at the same time we use it to then supplement that data for the edge cases, the underrepresented groups. So again, it's kind of does the bad and the good simultaneously, depending on how you manage it. And that's still today a very human thing that requires someone to go, no, that does not look right. Because we have to model that data to reality as best we understand it. The machine doesn't know that. It's just going to do what we say. Picking up on your point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting in terms of the actual training data itself as well. So in terms of how can we actually resolve and figure out what's missing and how we can plug those gaps if we're using synthetic data to plug them?
How do we plug the gaps?
Yeah.
I think if you can figure that out, you have a $1 billion enterprise on your hands. I think and like I sort of was saying, I think the reality is the reality. We have to go back to observation. At the end of the day, we know these are underrepresented groups because we can kind of look at that and say, that charging cable should probably not be there. That's not what I'm underrepresented group. Well, that might be an underrepresented group also, but for different reasons.
For different reasons, yeah.
But we can look at that and say, wait a minute, that's got a lot of biasy, that's got a lot of cultural significance for us that we can understand as humans, but it's still very difficult then to put that back into even words. We can sit here and discuss why that's a problem to what degree for hours. And then to give that back to the machine, it requires us to be able to directly say, no, you need to find other underrepresented groups. I think just on the BBC this morning, there was a woman who was an amputee talking about how image generation was not representing her and other people who have other amputations. And they're working on trying to bring those into the norm, right? These are things that are conversations we'll have to have that we already have in society. We talk about this as underrepresentation. The machine doesn't have the ability to understand that we do. So we need to be the ones to then go and say, this is what you need to look at. This is what you need to try and mirror and adjust. And until we can get to a point where we have general AI, it's going to require that very human touch. And I suspect even afterwards as well.
Yeah, so keep human in the loop kind of thing as well.
I would hope we would keep the human in the loop, yes.
I think just to Christina's point, what we've observed in our company at least is that younger, more junior employees don't do some of the basic steps. Like whatever comes out of the model, they just accept. There's no time spent checking the sources. Are those representative? Does it make sense? Oh no, AI said it, so it's true.
Right.
And that's going to require a lot of attention.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I mean, to switch lanes slightly and talk about privacy, which is another big issue here as well. I mean, Razorfish obviously works with a lot of global clients, and how do you kind of balance your data needs with privacy compliance when synthetic data is involved?
So, we have a data science team that we work with to ensure that the proper governance and the oversight is in place. But just to be clear, I mean, Razorfish is a part of Publicis Groupe. Publicis Groupe is a French company. So we are very acquainted with GDPR and all of those regulations. We only use group-approved tools, first of all. We ensure that if we're testing or doing any sort of piloting or prototyping, we're using synthetic data. So we're making up stuff just to see, is it working? Is this interesting? Do we think this is useful? And then again, when we actually work with clients, so we're working within enterprise environments that have passed our global security muster, and we ensure that clients are also aware if we are starting to use any of their first-party data, that we are actually putting that through all of the proper processes. And so I think it's more of, this is, because there is no, I would say, blanket regulation or governance model for how this stuff is going to work on a global scale. You must rely on, I think, these individual processes that are coming out of organizations, such as, group on our end. Yeah.
Interesting. And then maybe also from privacy from a data ethics point of view as well. Does synthetic data ever create privacy risks if in ideas maybe it too closely mirrors real individuals and things like that?
Yeah, it's going to be another of those it depends answers. One of the very common misconceptions I'm seeing at the moment is people thinking because it's synthetic, it's not subject to the usual GDPR or CCPA or whatever legislation affects the geography you're in. Depending on how you're using that data, it very well could fall under that. So if you're appending synthetic data to data about a real life individual, it's subject to all the same restrictions. You'd need your legitimate interests, you'd need your documentation on processing. That's a steep learning curve that a lot of people are going through at the moment. So if you are looking to extend what you know about a real life individual through synthetic data, there are absolutely privacy concerns that you need to be worried about. And then everything we've just talked about in relation to underrepresentation should be hot on your radar as well, because if you're growing your database about underrepresented groups, chances are you could be introducing biases or making them look a bit more mainstream than they actually are. If you're using already anonymized data, then there are far less issues and concerns, and there shouldn't, because the anonymized data doesn't have privacy implications for an individual. Even if you add synthetic elements to it, saying broadly applies. But I think the general message at the moment for people is be a lot more careful than you think you need to. This is a relatively new area, and don't think synthetic gets you off the hook for all of the existing privacy legislation.
And then perhaps like looking forward into when synthetic data might become more common and more used, and thinking about how we can balance this with real data as well. I know in the AI industry, there is some concerns about when models start training on themselves and on synthetic data created by themselves. There's this idea of model collapse, and there's a lot of concern about that. I wondered if you thought that was a real risk here. And
I mean, it's definitely a real risk, and it's probably exacerbated and slightly helped by synthetic data, as we spoke about. At the end of the day, what you're trying to do is get the model to be more accurate. With LLMs, when you get the kind of collapse, I think you spoke about this before, it becomes so generic.
It's just not interesting anymore.
It's not interesting anymore, and many of the times I see output, I'm going, well, yeah, that is not saying much. One of my favorite stories was early on in the recommendation system for email, or even text messages that would kind of give you the little, here's how you should reply. When they would look across the email content, they could not come up with anything that was a relevant response. It would recommend, I love you. And the reason is because I love you, turns out, is not correlated particularly strongly with the content of your message, but rather who you send it to. And so it would come up in like an email to your boss, I'll see you tonight for the meeting. It'd be like, thanks, I love you, as the option. And so obviously that's a kind of a funny and sort of cute example, but it does have real world implications in terms of, especially if we're talking about younger generations, for especially who trust, or people who are not as experienced, who get this data back and go, wow, that's an amazing media plan. This is, or something even potentially harder, like this is like a meal plan that's not particularly good and that we shouldn't trust. There are real world implications. We need to teach people, of course, to be skeptical of that and put their own kind of lens on things as well. But model collapse for sure, I think could be helped by synthetic data, but with overuse or improper use will just speed us toward that.
And I think I'm headed towards another "it depends" answer. Sorry, but.
And for the advertising industry in particular, so many great campaigns are built on the unexpected, surprising, inspiring
100%.
insight. And that's what we would need synthetic data to get to. And I think that's where the longest journey still.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's an amazing tool to get you started. But to get you that true, like that really unique insight that usually comes from one of those edge areas, that's not what it's made to do. But it can maybe point you in that direction. Maybe it can help you refine once you have that insight, right? And again, it acts as that machine that mirrors back what you're putting into it, right?
I mean, this is a difficult question, but what is a kind of like healthy ratio between the two? If we're talking about real data, we're talking about synthetic data, perhaps in terms of training first. I mean,
Healthy ratio, at the risk of it depends.
Yeah.
But look, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to go back to the beginning of what you want to accomplish. Why are you using synthetic data? Is it because you don't have access to that data, like we talked about? Is it for privacy concerns? Is it because the data doesn't exist and you're trying to...
Because the audience is so small.
So
There's just
small.
Nothing.
Yeah, the end count is there. Is it because they're non-existent? It's an edge case that perhaps it appears that, you looked at the model and you realized, oh, this is, a particular behavior that's not coming out at all. So we need to kind of over-represent that to kind of bring it up. Then you need to play around with it. And at the end of the day, what you're looking for is the accuracy of the model to improve. If the accuracy is not improving, then you probably are putting too much data in. I think the important part is test from the baseline of your existing data, then begin to supplement that with the synthetic data. So I can't give a direct percentage or proportion, unfortunately, but that's my observation. And I think this becomes even more interesting when we talk about behavioral data, because one of the, again, we talked about how I've been using synthetic data prior to LLMs. That was very much rules-based or heuristics. We were sort of saying, look, this is what we know about this audience, very explicit. But now what you can do is you can effectively ask LLMs to pretend to be a persona, pretend to be a group, and you're already got bias in there already from that, which exists in the existing model. And then if you then pull that out to create data to then supplement that model, it's kind of creating this hall of mirrors effect and exacerbating things further.
Interesting. And then in the marketing and in the insight industry, where are we sort of drawing that line? Do you expect synthetic to get better? Do you expect to be using more of it in the future?
Absolutely, we'll be using more. I mean, the cost and efficiency savings are immense potentially, and it can drive research to a scale that may just not be possible otherwise. And to be clear, already there are some very good use cases for early stage concept testing. It's great. Talking to your persona is a lot of fun and can produce some unexpected insights. And things like good old conjoint or max diff analysis, the results are pretty good already. So I think those areas where the results are good enough or inspiring enough will continue to increase.
I think really one of the areas where we're the most successful is just this idea of talking to data that you've already acquired. So imagine extending the life of your first party research. Think of it that way. So if you can use survey data that you went out, you commissioned research, you now can take that unstructured data and you can give it to your LLM chat experience, and you can actually model out personas based on real research. And now maybe there are ways for you to interact with it in an extended or different way. But if you continue, I think that is probably a great way to think about. But starting just with synthetic data is probably not the path at the moment. You have to augment it, supplement it with something real and human-derived.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, well, I want to turn it to you guys as well and make sure you get a chance. So does anybody have any questions? Mics, or do we?
Fascinating. I would like to just probe a bit about the concept that you're talking around synthetic data, whereas a lot of the illustrations have been actually getting synthetic answers from data sets which are largely frontier models. You started talking about frontier models. There's some companies, there's one in Toronto called, I think it's called Ask Ditto, and they're essentially taking electoral register data and behavioral data and fusing it together so that these are real archetypes and massive numbers, and using those as an audience to do research. Now, there's an element of synthesis here because they're obviously all being renamed, but the actual behavioral characteristics are true and they're well reported. But what's fascinating to me is that the research that they're able to do can lean into audiences that just don't respond to traditional research. If you want to get CEOs to respond, you want to get a whole load of people that just don't respond. Whereas this stuff, it actually works in real time. And I agree with so many of the sentiments, like testing creatives, testing political views. I mean, there's so many things that you can test. But when you've got a sample that's 500,000, you can really push the boundaries of what was even possible from research in the past. And I think that type of synthesis, it may well register some polarization, it might not be so inclusive, but what it actually delivers is a fundamental shift in the way we understand behavior. And the other point I would make is that so many times you do research, you ask a question and people answer the question, but actually they construct an answer which is not actually what they think.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you interpret the answer in a way that you want to interpret it rather than actually how it is. And you see this time after time. People actually say one thing and they mean something completely different. And I think that this notion of synthetic probing of real behaviors could jump through that hoop, because we'll be able to understand how it's possible to reinterpret true behavior or true indicative thought from the points of reference that we have. And I'd love you to respond to that rambling. I'm not sure it's a question, but I wanted to share something.
I'll agree with you on the point. If you look at political polling in the United States, it did not pick up where we currently ended up. It's all I'm going to say. Like, right? So it did not. And so this is a great question. I think you're probably the person to answer it. But
yeah, I'd say I think there are two things. One is a lot of the best insights, I would say, come from that gap between stated intention and actual behavior. There are all sorts of great insights because we, like you say, we say one thing and we do another, or we think one thing and then we don't behave in a way that reflects that. My worry is synthetic is that actually gets eroded because they lose some of that human contradiction and nuance. The wider point, though, is, yes, that example where it's 500,000 people, there are immense benefits that come from that. And in many cases, it will be good enough. And that's probably the level that a lot of people are looking for. Not perfect, but good enough. We survey about 2 million people a year across 50 countries. So all the testing we've been doing has been, we've got the original true data, and we can compare what the models are spitting out. And the results are nowhere near passable, no matter which type of company we've worked with or whether we tested internally. They're nowhere near passable yet. It will get better and better really, really quickly. But again, the more niche or underrepresented the audience, like you say, you can't get CEOs to complete anything. So there's very little way to validate what's coming out of synthetically created CEO responses, unless it's about such mainstream things that the answers are bland, predictable, and generic, and then you're back to that vicious circle of what's the point of this in the first place. We've done particular testing on CEOs, on business decision makers, on healthcare professionals, on policy decision makers, and right now the results aren't good enough. They will get there, I have no doubt about that. But again, I guess my message is be cautious about the quality of the input data at the moment, because it's still on a steep learning.
Do we have any more questions?
Thank you. My question is going to be for Graham. As an ex-Googler, my loyalty is towards Gemini. So my question is, as we continue using these Gen AI tools, obviously checking the resource and the source material is the most important thing. So my question is, what is the rigor between the amount of hallucination that you get from the Gen AI responses versus the actual web source and the scanning of that source and making sure that it is, the confidence level is always high?
Yeah, so I don't work on Gemini specifically. I work on internal platforms just as context, but this is a real problem for us because we have direct access to data and we're using LLMs to, across the Google workforce, let them go off and get answers. So getting accurate answers is really important. The problem, and I always say this, is hallucination is not a bug, it's a feature. When you ask the LLM to create something, the entire thing is a hallucination. It has never been written before, or it's been written in a different way. That is by the nature what the system is doing. The difference is untangling what is useful to you, what is accurate in your view, and is there also, which is, pardon me, is the subjective side, but also the objective truth. And so there's things like Notebook LM, which I hope everyone has used, a Google tool.
Excellent.
Yes, very good. I know the team. We're partnering with them. They, for example, started the referencing, which is really great. You can put in your own documents. You can begin to interrogate the data. You can click links directly back to the sources to confirm that it has understood what you want from it as best you can. There's also the important point around the provenance and quality of the data. Something internally we're dealing with is we have a lot of internal data. This is nothing external. This is just years of Googlers creating information. Is it accurate? Is it up to date? Is it the most recent information that is correct for that product, for example? How do we take all that and effectively determine this is good quality? And that is a problem we're working on right now. So for me, I would say that it's a combination of subjective and objective. And again, if you've taken one thing, it's remembering that the humans still have to be that final layer to review, and you cannot put 100% faith in any system to tell you what exactly you're looking at. And incidentally, my photo is AI generated, if you're wondering why I look a lot better. Thanks, Gemini.
Any more questions from the audience? It can be about Graham's photo.
Yes, please. I just put in middle-aged white guy with glasses, and that's what came out.
It's unbelievable.
I know. Yeah, it's uncanny, isn't it? Yeah. Too many training data like me.
So essentially, I remember a time when I worked on a robot and was trying to detect objects. And the foundation models I used, if you want to call them that, they were more segmentation models. You could really tell they were great. They had a lot of knowledge stored in their lower layers, but they just didn't know what I was looking for. And so there I was doing the typical things. I was trying to do some synthetic data augmentation, not completely naive. Like I deliberately used the full rendering engine so that would be closer to reality rather than a game engine. I did background substitution. I introduced color tints and noise and so on. So on the one hand, I mean, you certainly could have done a better job than me. I was time constrained, but still it was quite difficult. And ultimately I decided, okay, scratch that. I'll actually take 500 images, have them mturk annotated, and do it this way. And so my question is twofold. First, if you have at least 10 years background in AI, like I do, many people are not going to have that. So I'm sure that there are researchers who, if they are specialized enough, they might be able to bridge that real gap. But many people like me will not. Any advice on that and how we will see that? The second part of my question is I worked on machine common sense. And as you know, oftentimes just models, again, pretty big model was a project I was on. Was an MIT, Harvard, Stanford project with DARPA involved and everything, so quite a few resources. It was interesting to see how, so twofold. On the one hand, a lot of knowledge just isn't stored, right? That water is wet is not written anywhere. So there I have a similar problem, and I also wouldn't even know how to begin to create data for that. And then just as a fun fact, there was a tier 3 that focused completely on foundation models, and they had a, I think, 3-year agenda. And when they introduced foundation models, they just solved the entire 3 years right away. And then they shifted focus and asked, okay, they solved everything, but are they really as smart? So to summarize my long question, sorry for that, it's just the simple real gap and the lack of machine common sense. Any advice on that and predictions how this is going to be tackled in platforms?
There's a lot to unpick there, and everyone's looking at me. To respond to one part, interestingly, everyone thought the value of researchers was going to diminish. There would be job losses and cuts, but actually the value placed on researchers seems to be going up and up and up because they have got that knowledge and can spot the things that you're talking about. And across many of the companies we work with at the moment, they're having to undertake much more rigorous training on how to use AI than they might have anticipated requiring, because it's so easy to pick up one of these tools and start using it that everyone thinks they're an expert straight away. But there's so much you have to teach people to use them properly and how to create a prompt that's accurate and is going to drive the results you want. So this is obviously admittedly for commercial organizations, but if you're representing one that isn't training your staff on how to use them at the moment, really should be. As to how to teach models that water is wet, I don't have the answer to that.
Inference, yeah. I can build just on the kind of skills maybe. Some of us who've been around a while remember when search first came out on the internet, people were putting in full sentences, and that is not, at the time, how search was designed. And there was a training of behavior that needed to happen where people started beginning to use operators and using keywords, for example. That took time for training audiences, while simultaneously those who created search engines were trying to meet people by also training the system to work better toward that, including systems that would take in full sentences. So I think it's kind of us meeting in the middle. We cannot ignore either side. Yeah, to kind of converge in the right ways. But it does underscore the importance of training individuals on how to use technology, and it doesn't matter what the technology is. This is just the next round.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I actually think we're at time. I'm sure there's infinitely more we can say on this, but I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists for a wonderful conversation.